Okay, let's get into something that, well, it really touches all of us at some point, how our brains handle loss.
Right.
But today, we're focusing in specifically on this really profound difference the brain seems to make
Hmm.
between the kind of grief when someone actually dies and the feelings when someone who's still alive just chooses to, leave your life.
Yeah, it's a really distinct difference people feel. And we've been looking at some pretty fascinating neuroscience studies for this.
Okay.
These studies look at which parts of the brain get active,
Yeah.
areas involved in emotion, bonding, like the amygdala.
Right, the emotional core.
Exactly. And then other areas more involved with, say, evaluation or social pain, think the prefrontal cortex, the insula.
Got it. So our goal here, our mission for this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
is to really try and unpack the science behind that powerful idea. Grief is not for the people still alive who chose not to stay.
Yeah.
We want to understand why. Why does the brain react so differently? Permanent, involuntary loss versus, well, voluntary abandonment.
Well, what the research seems to show, especially when you look at attachment neuroscience and brain imaging of people grieving,
Okay.
is that the brain appears to engage two pretty distinct systems. It really depends on the kind of loss.
Right.
So when we experience the death of someone close, the brain kicks into gear this deep, almost primitive emotional system. Sometimes it's called the mourning system.
Like a built-in biological response to that bond just being permanently broken.
Exactly that. You can think of it as the brain's sort of hardwired reaction to the irreversible loss of a really core connection.
Hmm.
And this activates areas like the amygdala. It triggers those intense feelings, longing, deep sadness, disorientation. It's biological, designed for someone being permanently non-negotiably gone.
The finality of it.
The finality, the person is gone, that's it.
Okay, so if that's the brain's reaction to death, what's happening then when someone is, still out there, but they've chosen they don't want to be in your life, like a friendship ending or a partner leaving?
Yeah, well, the sources we looked at really highlight that the brain processes that differently. It's still incredibly painful, don't get me wrong.
Of course.
But that kind of loss, it doesn't typically fire up that same deep, primitive mourning system built for irreversible separation.
So what does it do instead?
Instead, the brain seems to lean more on systems involved in, like, processing social information, evaluation, complex emotions.
And what does that look like neurologically speaking?
So this involves areas like the prefrontal cortex that's involved in reasoning, evaluating situations.
Right, the thinking part.
And the insula, which helps us process complex feelings, things like social pain, maybe anger, betrayal. It's a pathway more linked to understanding why something happened.
Processing rejection, maybe.
Processing rejection, exactly, or evaluating the other person's actions. It's definitely pain, yes, but it's neurologically distinct from that sort of pure involuntary separation response you see in grief for someone who has died.
Let's maybe use the examples the sources brought up. Sarah, who lost her father to cancer.
Yeah.
That activates the deep grief system, right?
Right. Because his absence was absolute. It wasn't a choice he made. Her brain is likely deep in that intense involuntary longing we talked about, that mourning system.
Okay, and then contrast that with John, his best friend, 15 years, just suddenly cuts him off.
John feels immense pain, no doubt about it. Significant pain. But the sources suggest his brain, over time, will likely process this more through the lens of, say, betrayal, confusion,
Rejection again.
rejection, because the person is still alive. Their absence was a decision. And this engages those different pathways, the ones involved in social evaluation, processing that betrayal. It's just different from the core grief response to death.
Wow, okay. That really clarifies the idea then. The pain is absolutely real in both situations.
Definitely.
But the brain is, like, quite literally running different software based on whether the loss was an irreversible death or a chosen departure.
That really is the core finding, the brain's architecture for processing loss. It seems finely tuned to the nature of that loss. So true grief, in that neurological sense tied to the primitive system, that seems reserved for the permanent involuntary separation that death brings.
And the feelings for those who choose to leave.
While still deeply painful, they engage different neural circuits, ones associated more with social pain, rejection, evaluation. It's a different landscape.
So thinking about you listening, navigating these really complex emotions of loss in your own life, What does this distinction mean?
Well, I think it means recognizing that the intensity and maybe even the flavor of your pain isn't random.
Right.
Your brain is responding with remarkable specificity. It knows whether a separation was forced upon you by death or if it was a deliberate choice someone else made.
And understanding that distinction, it could maybe validate the different ways these losses hit you.
Exactly. It can help validate why they feel different, why they might require different ways of processing or healing.
And the sources, they leave us with this really quite profound thought at the end. They describe true grief, the kind tied to that deep mourning system, as being sacred.
Yes, sacred. And crucially, they add that it belongs to those who had no choice in their leaving.
Wow.
So just consider that for a moment. What does it mean that the neuroscience seems to kind of parallel this idea
Yeah.
that the deepest, most primitive biological response is reserved for those separations where there was no choice, no agency involved?
Yeah, what does that distinction really reveal about the emotional weight, maybe the healing paths even, when loss is just inevitable versus when it's chosen by someone else?
It's a really profound difference, isn't it? And the science suggests it's etched right into our neural pathways, something to really reflect on.